if I have a client who isn't very socially skilled, you know, we might practice things like shaking hands and telling each other who we are, because if you don't have that down as a routine, it's difficult to make a foray into a broader social environment. So sometimes people are stopped socially because they lack micro skills, and sometimes it's because they're afraid, and those two things interplay. But another thing that happens in therapy an awful lot is that people come in for assertiveness training. You know, and they're people who've they're usually agreeable in temperament, but they're also people who have failed to integrate that capacity for aggression into their personality for one reason or another. Maybe they weren't taught to. That's certainly possible. Maybe when they manifested aggression, they were punished for it. Maybe they observed other people who were too aggressive and decided that they were never going to be like that. That's a common response. But it doesn't really matter, because once you're an adult and you're working in a competitive world, which you will definitely be, you have to have that capacity, because otherwise you get pushed to the bottom of the dominance hierarchy and exploited. And so, and it's not necessarily because of malevolence. Partly it can be that, but often it's the consequence of the fact that generally if you're negotiating for something, there are forces pulling on that from all directions. And what outcome is obviously right is not obvious at all. And so it's a matter of negotiation. And so you have to be able to put your position forward with some force and not be timid about it and be articulate about it. And all that is a consequence of integrating these systems that can be very dangerous if they're not working properly into your personality, rather than ignoring them and letting them run in an underground fashion, which is what they would do. Yes?
What you're talking about kind of reminds me of Freudian sublimation. Is that so good?
Yeah, well, the thing about Freud, so the comment was that it's reminiscent of Freudian sublimation. Freud more or less had an inhibitory model of socialization, you know, because he thought of people as pushed by the id, so that the ego, as pushed by the id and inhibited by the superego. And there's some truth in that, to the degree that you're subject to quasi-tyrannical pressure by a society that isn't well integrated. A lot of what's going to happen to you is, don't do that. And the capacity to not do something that you're motivated to do, like an impulsive thing, is obviously necessary. But sublimation, in a sense, is the basis of Piagetian theory. And Piaget's alternative to Freudian thinking is that it's not inhibitory, especially not if your personality is properly integrated. What it is instead is integration into a game-like structure. We're going to talk more about that. So the point is that you're starting at high levels of resolution with your body, you know, and you're building these structures out of your capacity to move and your capacity to perceive and these motivational systems that are driving you. And as you become socialized and as you bring more and more people into the conversation, the hierarchy gets more and more complex and sophisticated. And then it's the whole thing that's regulating. It's not inhibitory. You know, so you don't want to inhibit your aggression. You want to harness it so it serves the purposes of the individual and the greater good, if you can figure out how to do that. It's better that way because you have more power. Now, it might be better for you to be cowardly and retreating if the alternative is to be impulsively aggressive and destructive. But that's not nearly as good as having the capacity for aggression at your hand and being able to use it in a sophisticated manner. So, all right, so this is a way of thinking about how things, yes?
Is that simple, is it as simple to say, can it be said that that integration of these personality, motivational systems in your personality translates into more neural pathways between the subsystems in the brain?
I don't think you can say that it's that simple. I mean, I think that happens, but how it happens we don't know. And the thing too is that this organization does not only take place in your brain. That's another thing that the psychoanalysts, I think, overestimated, because they tended to think of psychic regulation as internal, but it's not. So, for example, as long as you're acceptable to your peers, you seldom have to regulate your own behavior, because they'll regulate it for you, right? And so when you're out in the world, I mean, you guys are all sitting there in a particular way. Partly because if you deviated from the appropriate way to sit there, whatever that is, if you deviated from that sufficiently, the group would turn on you right away. So as long as you're awake enough to respond to the subtle cues that people are giving you, you don't even have to worry about the internal inhibitory problem. Now what you want is you want your nervous system organized in a way so that it fits well into the overall organization of the society. And there has to be crosstalk between those. But society exists, right? So anything society will do to regulate you, you don't have to do. And that's really useful. It's an outsourcing problem. You know, and there's lots of things you outsource. So one of the things is, think about something like self-esteem. Now self-esteem is a very, I don't like the word, because self-esteem is really something like extroversion minus neuroticism. It's close to that. But so let's look at it in a slightly different way. Let's say, well, how valuable should you regard yourself? And so then you think, well, and then we might think, well, maybe that has something to do with competence. Okay, well, so how competent are you? Well, the answer to that is you really don't know, and there's actually no way of telling. So your nervous system has to guess, and the way it does that is that first, you're put on a normal distribution for negative emotion, and that you're just sort of given that at birth, that's your temperament. And then the socialization can pull that one way or another. You know, it can make you more stable or less stable depending on how you interact with your parents and the immediate environment and how dangerous the environment is. And then the next thing you do is you observe yourself operating in the world and you see how good you are at solving problems, and that adjusts it. And then everyone else is broadcasting to you all the time what your comparative value is. And so that's really how you establish an estimate of your competence. And it's almost always comparative competence, because the question in most groups isn't, can you do something? It is. But the real question is, can you do something as well or better than anyone else in this particular group? Because there's no absolute standard for being able to do things precisely, you know. Everyone is insufficient when you think of the ultimate task, right? Because people's knowledge have limits. So the question is, well, are you up for the challenge compared to the people around you? So it's a very complex calibration process, and it certainly doesn't all take place inside. It can't. You're not complex enough to do that, and it's foolish anyways. You know, partly what the stock market does, the stock market is a massive conversation about the relative value of property, roughly speaking. And it moves around a lot, because you think about all the variables that are being taken into account at the same time. It's not only every company and every commodity in relationship to every other company and every other commodity. It's also all that in relationship to the price of all the currencies. And that takes into account political stability or instability and disease and catastrophe and hurricanes and so on and so forth. And like there has to be something dynamic and ongoing that enables those calculations to be made, because it's incalculable otherwise. And the same thing is true in some sense of your competence. You can't calculate that on your own. You have to have help. And so that's partly why the group also decides where you are in the dominance hierarchy. Now the group can also under or overshoot. That happens lots of times, you know, because maybe the local environment that you're in isn't a very good representative of the broader environment. This happens to lots of smart people in high school, for example, or junior high, where if they're intelligent, that is not necessarily socially valuable for a number of years. And if the person who's intelligent doesn't get out of that environment into an environment where intelligence is valued, so hopefully that's a university, then you know, their actual potential isn't going to be valued by the dominance hierarchy in proper keeping with its actual real world value.